California has long been treated as real estate's safe harbor, the place where prices only move one direction and patience is always rewarded. Sun, innovation, culture, and global demand created the belief that buying here was never a mistake, only a matter of timing. But as we move through 2026, that belief is quietly breaking. Not with headlines screaming collapse, but with something far more dangerous: hesitation. Buyers pause instead of bidding. Sellers wait instead of celebrating. The math no longer cooperates, even while the image remains intact. What you see on postcards hasn't disappeared. Beaches are still beautiful. Campuses still attract talent. Venture capital still exists. Yet beneath that surface, affordability has collapsed for ordinary households. Insurance premiums have surged as wildfire, flood, and climate exposure intensify. Migration has shifted, not dramatically, but enough to matter. And when demand softens even slightly in a market built on constant inflow, pressure builds fast. This isn't a sudden downturn. It's a structural unwind already in motion. Official optimism hasn't caught up because averages hide stress. California can post growth while families lose breathing room. It can celebrate innovation while housing costs consume more than half of income. It can look strong while buyers quietly step back. Markets don't fail when people panic. They fail when participation thins, when fewer people can realistically play the game at all. That's why this video isn't about fear. It's about clarity. When you understand how housing cycles actually turn, you stop waiting for permission from headlines. You start watching behavior. Longer days on market. Rising price cuts. Builders slowing projects without announcements. Investors becoming cautious. These signals speak earlier than any report ever will. Some California cities are already breaking from the inside. Not collapsing, not burning down, but losing the assumptions that once held everything together. Safety margins are thinning. Flexibility is disappearing. And once those buffers are gone, adjustment becomes unavoidable. If you felt that the California housing story no longer matches lived experience, you're not wrong. You're simply noticing the shift before it becomes obvious. Stay with me, because what comes next isn't speculation. It's a countdown, city by city, showing where the cracks are deepest and why timing matters more now than belief. Subscribe and hit the bell. This shift is already unfolding. Pay attention early, think independently, and protect yourself before consensus realizes what has already changed nationwide soon. Most people think housing markets fail because of a single shock. A rate hike, a recession headline, a sudden crash. That belief keeps people reactive instead of prepared. In reality, markets fail quietly, through erosion, not explosions. The goal here is to give you a lens that turns noise into structure, so you stop guessing and start reading the system beneath the headlines. The first signal is the price-to-wage gap. When home prices rise faster than local incomes for years, demand doesn't disappear overnight. It becomes fragile. Buyers stretch. Debt increases. Participation narrows. Eventually, only a thin slice of buyers remains. And when borrowing costs rise or confidence dips, demand doesn't slow gradually. It vanishes. Markets that rely on constant optimism break fastest when that optimism pauses. Next is insurance and climate exposure, the cost most buyers underestimate. Rising wildfire, flood, and weather risk turns insurance into a stealth tax. Premiums rise. Coverage shrinks. Some homes become difficult to insure at all. This doesn't cause panic selling, but it quietly disqualifies buyers. When ownership itself feels uncertain, hesitation spreads long before prices reflect it. Migration trends reveal stress before statistics do. People don't leave the moment trouble appears. They leave when opportunity no longer offsets cost. When inflow slows and outflow accelerates, inventory builds silently. Homes sit longer. Sellers cut prices in stages. Population movement changes housing math years before it shows up in official data. Then there's investor versus end-user demand. Investor-driven markets rise quickly, but they reverse faster. When appreciation slows, investors don't negotiate, they exit. That sudden supply overwhelms buyers who were already stretched. End users move emotionally. Investors move mathematically. When math turns, momentum flips. Inventory buildup ties everything together. Rising listings aren't dangerous by themselves. What matters is absorption. When inventory grows faster than buyers can absorb it, price pressure becomes inevitable. Sellers don't panic at first. They wait. Then they reduce. Then they chase. That sequence defines early failure. What makes this framework powerful is repetition. You'll see these signals echo across different cities in different combinations. Some places break on insurance first, others on wages or migration. The order changes, but the mechanics stay consistent. That consistency is what gives you clarity before outcomes become obvious. This perspective also changes how you listen. Reassurance without numbers stops working. Fear without structure loses power quickly. Notice what's missing from this framework. Headlines, politics, predictions. Markets don't fail because people argue. They fail because math stops working across enough households at once. Understanding this removes fear. You're no longer waiting for collapse. You're watching structure weaken in real time. As we move through the cities ahead, keep this lens active. Price versus wages, insurance pressure, migration flow, investor exposure, inventory buildup. When several align, outcomes narrow quickly. Once you see this pattern, you don't need permission to act. You already understand what's unfolding everywhere you look. Subscribe and hit the bell, because once you see this lens, you can't unsee it. Number 10 is Los Angeles, a city still sold as the ultimate symbol of ambition and opportunity, but where the math of homeownership is quietly breaking down. Compared to coastal giants, prices look reasonable. Compared to local wages, they're not. On paper, this market appears balanced. In practice, buyers are stretching further each year just to participate. First-time buyers feel it most. They qualify, but barely. Monthly payments consume flexibility. Repairs get postponed. Savings thin. Homes aren't flying off the market anymore, but nothing feels urgent either. Listings sit a little longer. Sellers start offering credits. Price cuts appear quietly, not dramatically. This is recalculation, not collapse. And that's what makes it dangerous. People assume normal means safe, but normal is often the last phase before momentum turns. Number 9 is Oakland. Once seen as the Bay Area's affordable alternative, now facing a dangerous mix of outbound migration, rising crime perception, and collapsing buyer confidence. Culture, history, walkable neighborhoods, and a reputation that still attracts interest. But inside the housing market, stress is building. Crime concerns weigh heavier on buyers than they did a few years ago. Insurance costs creep up. Migration trends quietly reverse. Families leave for stability, not opportunity. Investors notice before residents do. They exit when appreciation slows, adding supply to a market already facing hesitation. Homes linger longer. Price reductions become common enough to stop feeling like exceptions. Buyers don't rush anymore. They negotiate, delay, or walk away entirely. The city still functions, restaurants stay busy, streets stay alive, but confidence thins. When safety and affordability erode together, demand weakens from the edges, inward. Number 8 is Stockton, a Central Valley city often marketed as California's last affordable refuge, but one where wages, debt, and housing costs are slipping out of alignment again. These markets once absorbed overflow from expensive metros. They promised space, affordability, and upward mobility. But inflation rewrote that equation. Commutes grew costly. Insurance rose. Wages failed to keep pace. Adjustable loans reset. Buyers who stretched during peak optimism now face tighter math. Inventory grows not because people panic sell, but because new construction collides with shrinking demand. Builders slow. Sellers reduce prices incrementally. Foreclosures tick upward just enough to be noticed, not enough to alarm. The market doesn't feel broken. It feels tired. And tired markets don't rebound quickly. What connects these cities isn't crisis, it's erosion. Each still operates, schools open, jobs exist, transactions happen. That normalcy hides the shift underneath. Buyers hesitate longer. Sellers chase expectations downward. Investors retreat. None of this makes headlines. But together, it changes trajectory. This is the early fracture stage, where belief outpaces math just slightly, where optimism still sounds reasonable, but no longer matches outcomes. People don't fear buying here, they doubt it. And doubt is far more powerful than fear because it spreads quietly. Families start asking different questions. Not, can we afford it, but should we? That shift matters. It slows demand without drama. It widens inventory without panic. It compresses prices over time rather than collapsing them overnight. These cities teach an important lesson. Housing markets don't fail at the top. They fail when participation narrows. When fewer people can comfortably buy, prices rely on thinner demand. Thinner demand means volatility. Volatility eventually means adjustment. If you're watching closely, the signals are clear. Days on market stretched. Price reductions normalize. Buyer urgency fades. The market still works, but only for those willing to stretch or speculate. That's not stability. That's fragility wearing a calm face. Most people miss this phase because it feels boring. Nothing dramatic happens. Life continues. That's why outcomes get locked in here. When adjustment finally becomes obvious, options shrink. These aren't the worst markets yet. They're the warning layer. The places where assumptions quietly stop working before anyone calls it a downturn. Stay with me, because the pressure accelerates from here. Number 7 is San Diego, a lifestyle city still wrapped in sunshine and prestige, but now showing unmistakable signs of inventory buildup, insurance stress, and buyer retreat. But lifestyle markets crack differently. They depend on discretionary income, travel, and second home demand, and all three fade quickly when uncertainty grows. Inventory starts stacking not because residents flee, but because investors quietly exit. Short-term rental math weakens. Bookings slow. Carrying costs rise. Homes that once sold on emotion now wait on spreadsheets. Insurance becomes the braking lever. Fire risk, coastal exposure, and climate volatility push premiums higher or remove coverage entirely. Buyers hesitate when protection feels uncertain. Sellers reduce prices not in panic, but in resignation. The city still looks beautiful, but beauty no longer closes deals. Number 6 is Burbank, an entertainment-adjacent suburb long viewed as stable, now strained by million-dollar price tags, slowing demand, and shrinking affordability margins. For years, this kind of market lived off spillover demand. When the core boomed, this area followed. When the core slows, reality arrives with a lag. Layoffs don't need to be massive to matter. They only need to be persistent. As job security weakens, buyers recalculate risk. Dual-income households pause. Builders stall projects midstream. Inventory accumulates from both new listings and unsold developments. Homes sit longer. Price reductions grow sharper. HOA fees rise as associations spread fixed costs across fewer occupants. Insurance premiums jump due to heat, fire corridors, or aging infrastructure. Ownership starts to feel heavy. Not catastrophic, just exhausting. That's when belief breaks. People stop assuming appreciation will rescue them later. Number 5 is Santa Cruz, a coastal dream city where extreme price-to-income ratios and escalating climate insurance costs are draining momentum fast. These cities live on identity. Buyers didn't just purchase homes. They bought status, lifestyle, and permanence. But prestige is fragile when carrying costs explode. Property taxes climb. Insurance becomes punitive or unavailable. Utilities spike under climate stress. Maintenance costs balloon. At the same time, buyer pools shrink. Wealth concentrates, but liquidity disappears. High-end inventory lingers. Price cuts appear, even at the top. Investors who expected safety discover concentration risk instead. When a luxury market turns, it doesn't crash first. It freezes. Transactions dry up. Developers shelve projects. Sellers wait, then chase. The illusion holds until math forces the conversation. Across these three cities, stress becomes visible. You don't need charts to feel it. Empty listings linger through peak seasons. For sale signs don't rotate anymore. Construction pauses mid-phase. Local governments quietly warn of budget strain as transfer taxes fall. Foreclosures tick upward, not explosively, but consistently. Each one adds pressure without drama. Optimism lags reality because people remember how strong things felt just a few years ago. That memory delays adjustment, but it doesn't prevent it. This is where denial usually breaks. Not because of headlines, but because numbers stop cooperating. When insurance premiums rival mortgage payments, ownership loses its appeal. When investor exits add supply faster than residents can absorb it, prices soften mechanically. When development stalls, confidence drains from the ecosystem. These are not emotional reactions. They are responses to constraints. What's important here is inevitability, not fear. These markets didn't fail because they were bad places to live. They failed because expectations outpaced sustainability. Lifestyle demand, job adjacency, and prestige all amplify cycles. They rise faster, and when conditions tighten, they unwind visibly. The process feels slow until it suddenly feels obvious. People sense it before they articulate it. Conversations change. Buyers ask about exit strategies instead of upgrades. Sellers ask how long they can wait rather than how high they can price. Investors compare alternatives instead of doubling down. That shift marks the transition from strain to dysfunction. These cities still function. Cafes stay open. Events continue. Life looks normal, but markets don't need chaos to adjust. They only need friction. Once friction exceeds enthusiasm, momentum reverses. If you're watching closely, this stage is unmistakable. Inventory builds. Insurance withdraws. Capital hesitates. Belief erodes after math already has. By the time consensus agrees, pricing has already moved. Subscribe and hit the bell, because this is where denial usually breaks. Number 4 is Santa Barbara, a high-status coastal city where wealth and beauty are no longer enough to offset insurance withdrawal, labor shortages, and weakening demand. This is the market people point to as different, the place where wealth, scenery, and exclusivity are supposed to override fundamentals. But structural strain doesn't care about branding. In these cities, home prices detached from local incomes years ago and survived only because buyers assumed permanence. Now the stress shows up in less glamorous ways. Insurance carriers retreat or sharply restrict coverage. Property taxes rise, as municipalities scramble to fund services for shrinking full-time populations. Second homeowners reconsider the cost of holding something they rarely use. Inventory grows slowly, then steadily, as prestige stops compensating for risk. Nothing collapses overnight. Instead, demand thins until sellers realize the old price logic no longer applies. Number 3 is Palm Springs, a cultural and lifestyle hub now exposed to climate pressure, investor saturation, and rising operating costs that buyers can no longer ignore. These markets were never cheap, but they justified cost through opportunity and momentum. That bargain is breaking, as remote work reshapes employment and layoffs ripple through once dominant sectors. The gravitational pull weakens. People don't leave because the city lost its soul. They leave because the math stopped working. Crime perception matters here, not always because it spikes dramatically, but because tolerance drops when people are already stretched. Insurance premiums climb. HEA fees rise as buildings age and reserves fall short. Investors who once fueled demand now hesitate, realizing appreciation can't outrun carrying costs forever. Listings linger, rents soften. Confidence erodes quietly, but once momentum flips, it's difficult to reverse. Then there's number 2, the global prestige market. Number 2 is Mendocino, a picturesque but structurally strained market where isolation, wildfire exposure, and collapsing affordability have quietly broken buyer confidence. This is the city outsiders still view as untouchable, a symbol of innovation, culture, and wealth on a world stage. But global status doesn't insulate against structural pressure. It magnifies it. Housing here is no longer priced for residents, but for capital. And capital is cautious now. Tech volatility, work from anywhere flexibility, and rising costs change behavior. Population loss doesn't need to be massive to matter. Even modest outflows strain budgets, transit systems, and service funding. Office vacancies spill into residential weakness. Condo fees surge. Insurance costs climb in seismic or fire-exposed zones. Developers pause projects mid-cycle. The market doesn't crash. It stalls, then reprices lower as expectations adjust. What unites these three cities is convergence. Insurance failure meets tax pressure. Investor saturation meets population loss. Crime perception meets declining tolerance. Each force alone is manageable. Together, they narrow options fast. This is where the myth that size equals safety finally breaks. Large, wealthy cities carry large, inflexible obligations. When revenue growth slows, those obligations don't. They squeeze households and governments simultaneously. The emotional trap here is familiarity. People assume what's famous is resilient. They believe prestige guarantees recovery. But markets don't recover on belief. They recover on balance. When costs rise faster than incomes and risk rises faster than reward, demand adjusts regardless of narrative. That adjustment shows up first as hesitation, then as price reductions, then as stalled activity. These cities are not failing because they lost appeal. They're failing because they became dependent on conditions that no longer exist. Cheap capital, endless migration, unquestioned optimism. When those inputs disappear, structure determines outcome. And structurally, these markets are tight, expensive, and inflexible. This stage feels unsettling because it challenges deeply held assumptions. People want to believe the most important cities are immune. But immunity doesn't exist in economics. Only buffers do. And buffers thin when obligations grow faster than adaptability. If you're paying attention, you can see the shift in language. Sellers talk about timing instead of upside. Buyers ask about exit paths instead of renovations. Governments discuss gaps instead of growth. None of this is panic. It's recalibration. Understanding this doesn't mean avoiding cities blindly. It means recognizing where structural pressure limits flexibility. When everything converges in one place, recovery takes longer and costs more. These are the epicenters because they amplify both booms and corrections. Subscribe and hit the bell because the epicenter always matters most. Number 1 is San Francisco, the city once considered untouchable, where prestige failed to protect affordability, safety, or demand. For decades, this city was treated as untouchable, a place where innovation, wealth, and global status were supposed to override every economic rule. People believed high prices were proof of strength, not risk. But by 2026, that belief has cracked, and what's left is a city confronting limits it once thought it didn't have. San Francisco didn't fail because it lost relevance. It failed because prestige couldn't compensate for affordability, safety concerns, and eroding confidence all at once. Home prices remain staggeringly high, yet demand no longer matches them. Buyers hesitate, not because they dislike the city, but because the math no longer rewards commitment. Mortgage costs, taxes, insurance, and HOA fees stack into monthly obligations that feel indefensible, even for high earners. What makes this moment different is migration. When people quietly stop arriving and begin leaving, the system changes character. Over the past few years, professionals, families, and small businesses have drifted out, not in panic, but in search of balance. Each departure thins demand just enough to matter. Inventory builds slowly at first, then more visibly. Listings linger. Price reductions become normal. Confidence doesn't collapse dramatically. It drains. Safety and quality of life compound the issue. Perception matters in housing, and tolerance drops when costs are already extreme. When buyers feel they're paying more for less certainty, the emotional contract breaks. Investors sense it early. Developers pause projects. Lenders tighten. What once felt like inevitability starts feeling fragile. This is the betrayal that hits hardest. San Francisco was supposed to be different. It was the exception people pointed to when other markets struggled. But exceptions don't exist when structural pressure converges. High costs, population loss, insurance risk, and shifting work patterns don't cancel each other out. They multiply. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This isn't just a local story. San Francisco is a warning, not an outlier. It shows what happens when belief outlasts balance. When identity replaces arithmetic. When a market assumes demand will always return, even as the reasons people came quietly disappear. That's why this moment matters. If a city with global prestige, immense wealth, and cultural influence can stall, any city can. Not because collapse is imminent everywhere, but because no market is immune to misaligned fundamentals. Watching this unfold isn't about fear, it's about clarity. When you recognize that reputation doesn't protect against imbalance, you start evaluating places differently. You look at sustainability instead of status. You ask harder questions earlier. San Francisco reached the breaking point first, not because it was weak, but because it was heavy. Heavy with expectations, costs, and obligations. And when pressure rises, the heaviest systems feel it most. Subscribe and hit the bell, because this isn't theoretical anymore. Stepping back, what matters most isn't which city ranked worst, but the pattern that tied all 10 together. Because once you see that pattern, housing markets stop feeling mysterious and start feeling readable. Every city we covered followed the same quiet sequence. Prices ran ahead of wages, ownership costs crept higher than incomes, demand softened before anyone called it a downturn, and confidence faded long before headlines changed tone. This isn't about fear. It's about understanding signals early enough to keep choice on your side. Here's the reality check you can carry anywhere. First, compare home prices to local wages, not to last year's prices. When incomes can't realistically support ownership without extreme leverage, demand becomes fragile by default. Second, weigh insurance costs against income growth. Rising premiums behave like hidden rate hikes, shrinking affordability without touching listing prices. Third, watch inventory relative to real buyer demand. When listings rise while serious buyers hesitate, price stability becomes a story, not a fact. Next, separate investors from end users. Markets dominated by investors look healthy until returns compress. When rents flatten or carrying costs rise, investors exit quickly, leaving supply behind. Then track migration direction. People don't leave suddenly, but when fewer arrive than depart, pressure builds quietly. Housing doesn't crash on the first move. It weakens as momentum reverses. None of these signals require panic to matter. They only require alignment. When several appear together, outcomes narrow regardless of optimism. This is where empowerment replaces anxiety. You stop waiting for permission from experts and start testing claims against structure. You notice when reassurance lacks math and when fear lacks grounding. What happens next in California won't be uniform, and it won't be immediate. Some cities will stabilize, others will slip further, and a few will surprise everyone. That uncertainty is exactly why this framework matters. It lets you adapt instead of react, plan instead of chase, and evaluate markets on sustainability rather than reputation. I want to hear from you. Which city or state do you think shows these signals next? And why? Drop your prediction in the comments because collective insight sharpens awareness. Subscribe and hit the bell because I'll track the next break before it's obvious. Use this checklist as a filter, not a verdict, and you'll navigate uncertainty with steadier judgment, clearer timing, and far less regret than those chasing reassurance after markets have already shifted away.